At least 122 Palestinians, including 27 children, have now been killed as Israel intensifies its bombardment of Gaza. The UN has said that more than 200 homes and 24 schools have been destroyed or severely damaged in the Gaza Strip in the past 5 days. It also warned that Israeli airstrikes could limit residents' access to fresh water due to power cuts and damage to pipe networks. Now, the abject terror of living in Gaza right now was visible in distressing videos such as this shared on social media. Now, social media is full of videos, full of accounts like that. It's what millions of people are currently living under right now. Hamas rockets have, of course, also been continued to be fired at Israeli towns and cities. So far, they've killed 9 people, including 1 child and 1 soldier. Meanwhile, so that's Gaza. Meanwhile, across or within Israel's 1948 borders, right-wing Jews have attacked Palestinians. This includes some, again, horrific footage. This is, essentially a lynching in Bat Yam near Tel Aviv on Wednesday. Now, we aren't going to show you the whole clip because it's, quite frankly, just too graphic. But here you can see young Israeli Jews dragging a Palestinian from a car and brutally attacking him. According to the Can News Network, who recorded this footage and broadcast it live, there were no police present. As I said, we're going to cut this out before the end, but it does go on to show the mob punching a Palestinian man in the face as he lies semi-conscious on the floor. Really, really, really difficult to watch. The far-right mob you saw there in Bat Yam also attacked Palestinian-owned businesses, some chanting death to Arabs. Now, within Israel, Jewish citizens have also been targeted, including in the city of Lid, where a Jewish man was stabbed on his way to synagogue. At least 1 synagogue has also been burned, been set on fire. Also in Lid, a pregnant Arab woman was attacked and suffered serious head injuries. Now, as well as unrest across Israel and a battle between the IDF and Hamas in Gaza, we are beginning to see a wave of protests in the occupied West Bank. Now, you can see here footage from the Palestinian city of Nablus. That was last night. Protests have continued across the West Bank today, with at least 7 protesters having been killed by the Israeli military. That's all within the borders of historic Palestine. Protests and unrest has not been limited to that region, though. There are also protests at the Jordanian border and the border with Lebanon today. We can show you some images from protests on the border between Jordan and the occupied West Bank. Now, it's reported that Palestinian refugees in Jordan have since breached the border with occupied Palestine. That border is, of course, controlled by Israel. I'm joined now by Dr. Yara Hawari, a senior policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, a Palestinian think tank. Yara is based in the occupied West Bank. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we are going to talk and focus on sort of the movements, the violence, the uprisings across the region. I do want to focus, though, first of all, on the situation in Gaza. There was some confusion last night when the IDF tweeted ground forces were engaged in Gaza. Then they said, actually, they haven't entered Gaza. They're just, sort of, I suppose, sending in rockets from outside Gaza. What's your understanding on the latest happenings there? Do you think we are on the cusp of a full-blown ground invasion?
I think it's entirely possible, considering the Israeli political situation at the moment. Of course, Israel doesn't have a government. It still was in the midst of forming a coalition government. Netanyahu hadn't managed to do that yet. And so, to be honest, this might be the perfect opportunity for him to get that majority that he needs violence. We know that the Israeli electorate is quite far right, and violence against Palestinians, particularly those in Gaza, is, to be quite frank, it's a winner in elections. I mean, the opposition figure Benny Gantz, who was being touted as this sort of liberal savior by the European Union, used footage of bombing Gaza in 2014 in his electoral video campaign. So, you know, it's very obvious what the majority of the Israeli public think towards Gaza, and I think it's entirely possible that we do reach that. Having said that, I don't think that Israel, or at least Netanyahu, does want a full blown out war, especially considering what is happening at the moment elsewhere across historic Palestine. It's facing, the Israeli government's facing this huge internal, what it calls an internal issue. All these protests from Palestinian communities within 48, within Israel proper, and now as well with all these what they consider threats at the border. So, to be honest, Israel can't fight all of these fronts, and so that might be a saving grace for the people of Gaza. And I sincerely hope that the Israeli airstrikes do stop, because what we've heard from friends and comrades in Gaza is that the last few days have been the worst bombardments they have ever seen. And, you know, there are people as young as 20 who've seen 4 or 5 consecutive wars now, and they're saying that this was the worst. Last night was the worst night that they have ever lived. And, you know, we have reports that, you know, from friends that they were sending their last sort of messages, farewell messages to people overnight. So I sincerely hope that the barrage does end soon.
I want to talk about what's going on inside Israel proper, the 1948 borders, because as well as the bombardment of Gaza, I think this is at the moment what's getting the most international coverage. It's often reported as communal or sectarian violence. I kind of want to know if that's a categorization you think is fair. But we showed there a video of Arabs attacking, far right Jews attacking Arabs, attacking Palestinians. We also know there are Jews who are being attacked in Israel. Do you think seeing this as communal violence or sectarian violence really gets what's going on? How should we understand the violence and conflicts that we're currently seeing within the borders of Israel?
So this is Israel's narrative that this is an internal issue and it should be dealt with internally, and that it's sectarian. And one of the reasons it does that is to hide the fact that it has a Palestinian population within Israel. A lot of people don't know that 20% of the population of Israel are actually indigenous Palestinians, who are often labeled Israeli Arabs as a way to sort of hide their Palestinian identity. But it's also to obscure the reality and the context, which is of a settler colonial state. This isn't, you know, Arabs versus Jews. This is settler colonialists versus the indigenous people, and the indigenous people are fighting for their survival. And the sectarian narrative also serves the interest of Israel by sort of warding off international intervention, because of course the UN and international organizations are sort of heavily involved in condemning things in the West Bank and Gaza, because they see it as their international responsibility. But when it comes to Israel internally, Israel can sort of fend off those criticisms by saying that it's a domestic issue, you know, maybe one of discrimination or, you know, sort of, sectarianism, when actually it's not the case at all. What we're learning and what increasingly is becoming understood is that the policies in the West Bank certainly are also the policies that the Israeli government carries out towards Palestinians in the West Bank are also carried out across the Green Line. And for Palestinian citizens of Israel, which is the sort of preferred label, we have lived this, we have known this since our existence. But because of sort of the parameters of international law and that the mainstream discourse, that our story and our community has often been forgotten and erased.
This is kind of a background question, but this is being presented as something quite new. sort of, well, as whether or not you want to characterize it as communal violence, but anyway, violence between communities in Israel. I mean, particularly most prominently, it seems like far right attacks on Palestinian citizens of Israel. Is that something which is relatively new, or is this an ongoing thing which has only just sort of increased in the last few days?
To be honest, it's been ongoing. I think it's escalated in the last few days. We haven't seen this, certainly not in my generation, this kind of these kind of lynch mobs to this extent across the country. You know, there have always, we in Palestine, we talk about it as the continuous Nakba, the ongoing Nakba, which of course refers to the ethnic cleansing of 1948. And when we say that, we mean to say that it continues. This project or process of erasure has continued, and we have seen it in the displacement of our people, the theft of our land, the extrajudicial killings, ethnic cleansing, etc. But to this large extent, to have these kinds of settler mobs carrying out lynchings and assaults and supported by the police and by the security forces is definitely something unprecedented in my generation. But it's also not surprising to us. You know, we have always been on edge that this could happen to us. There have been many points throughout history where, and recent history actually, where Israeli politicians have talked about wiping us out, that, you know, we're the cancer in Israeli society, the surviving indigenous population, and that we need to be either, you know, eliminated, or we need to be encouraged to leave, or they threaten us with expelling us to the West Bank or to Gaza. So it is certainly unprecedented for me, but it's also not unexpected at all.
Let's talk about the Palestinian resistance to this. And we've had a number of guests on this week who've really put forward an idea that, you know, in a way, whilst what's going on is absolutely terrible, in a way there's also sources of hope, which is that the Palestinian struggle seems much more united than it has in a long time. You're seeing protests in Israel proper, you're seeing protests in the West Bank, obviously Gaza are resisting in their own ways, and then now you're even seeing protests, you know, in Jordan and Lebanon. Does this seem to you a more sort of united and powerful form of Palestinian resistance than we've seen for a long time, and if so, why do you think that's happening now?
Yeah, I think so. This is just the permanent condition of being Palestinian, is because we live in this continuous state of tragedy. We, you know, whenever we see glimmers of hope, there's always something devastating going on at the same time. So we've become very used to it, you know, where there's laughter, tears really aren't far behind. And personally, you know, I've been crying and smiling throughout the last few weeks. And I guess it's different for different Palestinian communities in Gaza. The situation is so devastating, but I do think there are glimmers of hope. The way that Palestinians have been mobilizing across historic Palestine, and I mean, you know, the West Bank, Gaza, 48, which refers to the state of Israel, the Palestinian communities in Israel. And also in exile in the diaspora, and it's pretty phenomenal. We haven't seen this level of mobilization for a long time, particularly because Israel has pursued policies, deliberate policies of fragmentation, of social, political, and geographic fragmentation. I cannot go to Gaza. I physically cannot go to Gaza. The only way that I can have communication with my brothers and sisters in Gaza is online, and even that we know is heavily monitored. So you can't even begin to understand the level of fragmentation that Palestinians exist in. And yet we have these protests and we have people coming out, and let's not forget that the sparkle of all of this was Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood in Jerusalem that was facing imminent ethnic cleansing, and people all over historic Palestine came out because they saw that it was a complete reiteration of what they have experienced, or what their parents have experienced, or what their grandparents have experienced. You know, the scenes that we've seen, the videos, the things that we've experienced over the last few weeks remind me so much of what my grandparents told me happened in 1948, the lynchings, the driving of Palestinians from their homes, the beatings in the street. It's simply a reiteration. It's a continuous process. And so the fact that Palestinians, despite this continuation of ethnic cleansing, of settler colonialism, can come together has been incredibly inspiring to me, and I think also to a lot of Palestinians all over the world.
And my final question is what are the events of the last 2 weeks? I suppose there's been too many of them to list. What effect is that going to have on the internal politics of Palestine? I know you're based in the West Bank. At the moment, it seems like the Palestinian Authority, which is led by Mahmoud Abbas, is, concerned that it's going to become irrelevant. Obviously, Hamas, one of the reasons they started sending rockets is because they wanted to be seen as defenders of the Al-Aqsa Mosque when it was trashed by the Israeli police forces. How will the PA, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, come into play here? Do you see what direction they're going to go in? Are they going to say we are going to join this round of resistance against Israel, or do you think there's going to be a rebellion against them even?
Michael, I smiled several times during your question, because firstly, I don't think they are worried about becoming irrelevant, because they're already irrelevant. The PA it doesn't have any legitimacy amongst its own people. The only friends it has is in the international donor community, because they maintain the status quo, because they keep Palestinians silent. They are not a representative body. They're not an accountable body. They're not considered a legitimate leadership. And their position and their silence and absence during this uprising further cements that. And I have to say, they haven't even, they've been absent, but they've also been present on the streets in full security get-up. We've seen in the streets of Ramallah and other places, we've seen them sort of scaremonger protesters. We've even seen them repress protesters. And I think they're afraid. I think they're afraid of a grassroots movement that unites all Palestinians, because it would solidify the fact that they are indeed irrelevant. And the fact that this comes off the back of elections which they failed to have, that no one was surprised that they cancelled, because this is, again, it's a body that is well past its electoral mandate, and no one has any faith in them. And I forgot what the second reason I smiled was, but I'm sure it was I forgot the second part of your question, but something about Abbas, but he always
I think you've basically covered it. I was going to say, are they going to try and prevent their own slide into irrelevancy? Yeah. And you've said they're already irrelevant, so it's sort of got ahead of the question.
I think you asked me if they would join in, and the answer to that is no, they will not join in this uprising, because this uprising speaks to everything that they are not, which is the status quo. They are the status quo, and this uprising is demanding a drastic change from the status quo.
Dr. Yara Hawari, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been incredibly insightful, and thanks so much for all of your updates. I'm sure we'll speak soon.
Thank you for having me.
Let's go to a couple of comments. Rajia D has said on the super chat, please join us to show solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. Assemble 12 p.m. at Marble Arch in London tomorrow and march to the embassy. I bet that's going to be a really big protest. So definitely, I completely back what Rajia D has said. Get down to Marble Arch at 12 p.m. tomorrow. MTG Forest with £5 asks, stupid question, but why doesn't the international community not condemn the actions of Israel and put pressure on them? Solidarity to Palestine and love to Novara Media. I don't think it's a stupid question. I think it's one of the key questions of our times, to be honest. In a way, it's almost, I don't think I can give a particularly sort of sophisticated answer to that question, other than to say it does show the sort of abject moral poverty of the United States and the United Kingdom, that all they can say is we condemn Hamas rockets and we condemn terrorism, and completely ignore the fact that what we're seeing at this point in time is a people who are being occupied, who are being subject to ethnic cleansing, and who are being bombed with airstrikes. Children are being killed, and all we hear from the UK and the US is sort of these anodyne statements such as, "Oh, we hope calm can be brought We hope we can bring people to the table. All of it is designed to obfuscate the fact that this isn't just some equal fight between two sides. It's not just a struggle between identity groups. It's systematic settler colonialism and repression and occupation and apartheid. And any government that had any ounce of moral decency would recognize it as such. But the UK, the US, Europe are unable to do so. I mean, presumably the big reason is that it's useful for them to have Israel in the Middle East as a military ally. But as I say, I'm probably not the best person to go into real detail on that particular question. And we're going to go on to a COVID story. First of all, if you haven't already, like the stream. An increase in cases of the so-called Indian variant of coronavirus has raised concerns about England's schedule for exiting lockdown. At least 1,768 cases of the B.1.617.2 strain have so far been identified in the UK. The rates of the B.1.617.2 strain are increasing, sort of almost looks like they're doubling every week. Now, that's particularly concerning, or has led scientists to the assessment that the Indian strain, or the so-called Indian strain, is more transmissible than the Kent variant. That's because cases of all the other variants are decreasing and cases of this variant are increasing. So pretty solid evidence that it's more transmissible. Some further evidence that it is, and also the effect this is having on coronavirus rates, can be seen in data from Bolton and Blackburn. Now, in both of these towns in Greater Manchester, these are places where there are significant levels of the so-called Indian strain, and you can see here that cases, when they had been falling for months, have begun to start rising in Bolton, at least quite dramatically, in the last week or so, or the last couple of weeks. I suppose the reason not to be too worried, or to not despair, let's say, is that, as you can see, the cases are mainly rising among younger people. So that'll be people who, one, haven't been vaccinated yet, and two, if they do catch COVID-19, are much less likely to end up in hospital or to end up passing away. So whilst we're seeing some worrying signs, there are also some reassuring ones. This increase in the so-called Indian variant led to lots of speculation that England's unlocking could be disrupted. Obviously, we are due to have a significant unlocking on Monday, probably the most significant one so far. People will be able to eat inside in pubs and bars alongside other restrictions being loosened. We can meet in each other's houses. Boris Johnson said that will still go ahead. None of that is being put on hold.
At this stage, there is no evidence of increased cases translating into unmanageable pressures on the NHS, even in Bolton, and infections, deaths and hospitalisations nationally remain at their lowest levels since last summer. So, and this is a balanced decision, I do not believe that we need, on the present evidence, to delay our roadmap, and we will proceed with our plan to move to step 3 in England from Monday. But I have to level with you that this new variant could pose a serious disruption to our progress and could make it more difficult to move to step 4 in June. And I must stress that we will do whatever it takes to keep the public safe.
So Boris Johnson there saying there's no reason not to go ahead with the May round of unlocking. He was less committal, though, about June. So in mid-June, we're expected to basically end pretty much all COVID restrictions. He hasn't committed to saying that will definitely happen. In terms of whether that will happen, one variable is obviously how resistant this new variant could be to vaccines. We now are pretty confident it's more transmissible than the Kent strain. Is it more resistant to vaccines? That's still somewhat up in the air. Chris Whitty, though, the Chief Medical Officer, gave quite a comprehensive answer about the current understanding on this issue, the assumptions that scientists are currently made. So he gave this explanation when answering a question on whether surge vaccination should be introduced for people in their 20s and 30s in areas where the so-called Indian variant is most prominent.
There's been a debate about this, but the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, which brings together all the experts on this, has been very clear on this. Now, the fundamental issue is that we have a finite supply at any given moment in time of vaccine. So if you vaccinate one person, by definition, you're not vaccinating another. Now, what do we know certain things about these vaccines? We have very high confidence that the vaccines provide very substantial protection against people dying and people having severe illness and people being hospitalized, less protection against people having more mild disease, and some protection, but less still, against transmission. And the expectation is with new variants that if you start to lose some vaccine efficacy, you lose it in the opposite direction. So in a sense, you first lose the very low protection of people having asymptomatic or very mild disease. Then you lose the protection against the more severe disease, and finally against the really most severe disease and people having mortality. Now, the reason I'm giving that long preamble is it's to explain why it is that the thing we know this vaccine absolutely can and should do is to protect those who are most vulnerable, and that is very heavily predicated by age with this particular virus. So therefore, if we took vaccine away from groups, let's say in their late 30s, and transferred them to groups of people who are 18 or 20, who are at much lower risk of severe disease, the view of JCVI, and I think this is the majority view, it's not an absolute view, but the view of JCVI has clearly been this would lead to a net disadvantage overall. So the sensible thing to do is to prioritise the vaccines to those who are most at risk in all the places across the UK, because the virus is a risk absolutely everywhere. But there are very strong aims to try and accelerate and make easier vaccination in the areas which are most affected by this virus. So it's not that we're not trying to take the geographical spread of this new variant, the B617.2, into account. We very much do want to do that.
So I thought that was both a very good explanation, one of why they're not going to introduce surge vaccinations in areas which are most affected by this variant, but also in doing so, sort of explaining what is and what isn't worrying about this variant. So he's saying that what vaccine escape would most likely mean, in the case of any of these variants, is that you would be more likely to catch it than you would the original COVID variant. But he's saying they have a reasonable degree of confidence that whatever variant you catch, if you're vaccinated, that will stop you going to hospital and will stop you dying. So that the most serious impacts of COVID-19, even if this variant has some vaccine escape, should be mitigated. I think we have Aaron Bastani on the show. How are you doing, Aaron?
Good evening, Michael. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. How are you feeling about the so-called Indian variant of coronavirus? Are you worried about it? Do you think that this could change your assessment? I remember last week we were talking about the unlocking and how we're quite confident that it's going quite well. Has this changed your assessment?
It's a tough one, Michael. I think for people out there, obviously they're listening to this story's come out of nowhere really in the last week, in the last several days in particular. And I think people, obviously, you have a recency bias and you think, well, the last time we got bad news from nowhere in a context of supposedly good news was December last year. And we then had a 3 to 4 month lockdown. And so that's just going to happen again, isn't it? I think we both agree that's not likely. What Chris Whitty said is that's not likely. The worst case scenario is we may need another lockdown, but we will see nothing like the hospitalization rate, the mortality rate. And even though there's been a major uptick in the number of documented cases of the Indian variant, of course, there are many more than the documented cases, that doesn't seem to have fed through so far to hospitalizations and a higher death rate. Why? Because actually the people getting it appear to be younger. That's a good thing in a way, because it shows that the vaccine the AstraZeneca vaccine is effective against this particular variant. That's really good. And so it's very much sort of wait and see. I think, and again, it's a recency bias. Well, we heard politicians say wait and see repeatedly last year, and that turned out to be terrible. But in this instance, wait and see is very different. It's not wait and see in the context of local lockdowns or, we think people should wash their hands. It's wait and see in the context of we have really good vaccination program, hundreds of thousands of people being vaccinated a day, in excess of 15 million vulnerable people now having 2 doses. So that's very different when they say wait and see, or even when you and I say wait and see. So in a way, this was inevitable. We knew that new variants would come along. We knew that there would be flare-ups, so to speak. I'm kind of heartened by what we're seeing so far. But as Chris Whitty said, the sample data is simply too small to draw large generalizations and conclusions. I personally think that things should open up next week. But I think people should be aware, and I thought Boris Johnson struck the right tone here. People should be perfectly aware that that may go into reverse at some point. But I think it's worthwhile opening things up and to basically, like you said, level with people. We may have to go into reverse, although I don't think that will necessarily be the case. I mean, we'll see. Like everybody's saying, the data isn't that conclusive. It could be very bad. Some of the models suggest this could be terrible, but the most likely sort of sequence of events is that it's manageable and it's nothing like what we saw after December.
For me, I don't think we're going into something like December. There have been modelling, actually. I think there's one from Warwick University which is suggesting if it were 30% more transmissible than the Kent variant or 50% more, we could have a situation worse than last December. I think that was on the assumption that all restrictions would be dropped, which is precisely why all restrictions shouldn't be dropped. I also don't know what other assumptions they'd made in that particular paper. One thing this is changing for me, I think, is how confident and comfortable I feel going inside from Monday onwards. Because I was thinking, I'm going to wait until I get my vaccine to go to the gym and to go to pubs, etc. I was getting into a frame of mind where I was like, look, there's barely any COVID-19 anywhere. Right, I can basically relax. This is making me feel like actually with this more transmissible strain, we could quite easily get into a situation where among the large sections of the population who aren't vaccinated, this does start spreading quite fast, which means I still want to take those same precautions that I've been taking up to now until I've had my vaccine. Aaron, you want to come in on that point very quickly?
I mean, the reason why I was a little bit late to today's show is I got caught up in meetings in London. And I have to say, Michael, I mean, obviously you're living there, so it's kind of your normal. But I've not gone in there for a while. I go in there obviously very infrequently in the last year. But today felt really different, and it was notably busier. There was a police officer on the underground not wearing a mask. There was a busker singing, which I just found. He was wearing a mask, but I was just like, this is ridiculous. If this guy's got COVID, he's potentially giving it to thousands of people over the course of a day. And then on the train coming back, there were two large groups of people, nobody wearing masks, drinking. And like you say, Michael, the data's been so positive for so long, all of a sudden you lose all those inhibitions. And that's the real worry, because I think this looks really manageable if people don't behave like that. If we wear masks indoors, if you keep to the rule of 6, if you try to keep outdoors as much as possible, etc., etc. So far, the data suggests this is entirely manageable. But, people have also had to be incredibly restrained for a year. So you may have these super spreader events, legal or otherwise, which create lots of problems. I expect lots of young people over the summer to hang out with each other and have massive parties. And that's entirely explicable because they've been subject to, horrendous restrictions for 12 months. But, that's the one sort of black swan event you could say or a sequence of black swan events where you have lots of these parties, they're super spreader events, and all of a sudden that does go back to their parents and grandparents. Because remember, yes, the vulnerable may be, they've been vaccinated, but it's not 100% efficacy. So if you did get, this sort of ripping through the population again, you would see large numbers of people dying again. Again, nothing like December, but we would start seeing that the present death toll, which is negligible, tick up quite significantly. So I think that's something that's really important. I mean, I almost got into a fight with these kids. There's about 20 kids, and I said, not one of you is wearing a mask. And they started having a go at me. And I said, well, look, if there's another lockdown, don't complain. But at the same time, I know if I was their age, I'd be tempted to do the exact same thing, especially if you've been adhering to the rules for a year. So, I think personally, this goes back further. We've not been giving the incentives to young people to actually adhere to the rules as strictly as they should. We can't just sort of stigmatise them and beat them down. They should be getting, I personally think young people should be getting sort of financial incentives and rewards for what they've had to put up with over the last 12 months. But perhaps that's a an out there opinion. I'm quite marginal in that respect.
A universal trust fund or something like that, I think would be a nice gesture, wouldn't it, from society for everyone who's stayed in for some of their most formative years. One of the questions that these new worrying statistics about the Indian strain have brought to light is the big question of why we didn't close down the borders slightly earlier. There were obviously so many people saying, look, everything's going really well. We're on track to loosen the lockdown, have quite a decent summer, unless a variant comes along which disrupts the vaccination program, which disrupts the schedule we are currently on. That's why lots of people said we should have universal hotel quarantine. The government said no. We actually only put India on the red list a week ago, even though we've known this strain was around for a really long time. By the way, the big story here is also, like, think of India, man. They had to deal with this strain which was more transmissible than our Kent variant. No wonder you had so many people catching it and hospitals being completely overwhelmed. I mean, we're worried about this now, and we've got 60% of adults vaccinated. In India, they had to deal with that when they had about 2% of adults vaccinated. So, you know, well, I suppose what can you say other than wow? I do want to go to the issue of the British borders, though, and how this is a bit of a fuck up from Boris Johnson, really. He got warned. He didn't listen. This question was put to him by Sam Coates today at that press briefing, and Boris Johnson tried to justify his record.
On the borders issue, the relevant committee was looking at was the threat of variants of concern coming from abroad, and at that stage, India was not identified as having a VOC, a variant of concern. So that was why the decision was taken. Pakistan, for instance, I think had 3 times as much of variants of concern. They had, in particular, the South African variant. So that was the reason for that decision. But don't forget that everybody coming, forgive me, from India or indeed anywhere else had to face very, very tough quarantine rules. They had to self-isolate. They had to produce their passenger locator form and so on.
They had very, very, very tough restrictions. They had to fill in their passenger locator form. I mean, that sentence is completely ridiculous. Obviously, unless you have mandatory hotel quarantine, these restrictions basically mean nothing. I mean, I know from people I know well, like the amount that people follow that guideline where you have to stay in your home for at least 5 days after you enter from elsewhere is not followed particularly strictly. Also, people take public transport from arriving at the airport to their homes. So the idea that there were tough measures, there were not tough measures. And that's why we're having these current worries at this moment in time. I have a comment from Nat H with a fiver. Long COVID is an important factor that is still being ignored or at best is being sidelined. A very important point. I do think it is silly for us to say the only big problem would be if there's hospitalizations and deaths. I get really worried every time Boris Johnson says, "Oh, but hospitals won't be overwhelmed." I'm like, is that really the what we're measuring everything against? Anything's fine unless the hospitals collapse. It's like, come on, there are quite a lot of intermediary phases between worry and everything is fine. Anyway, we're going to go straight on to our next story. A dawn raid to detain 2 asylum seekers and potentially deport them has been disrupted and blocked by protesters in Glasgow. Dawn raids are opposed by the Scottish government, but are under the control of the UK Home Office. The raids were seen as particularly provocative because they took place on the morning of Eid. Now, we can take you through some footage which shows you exactly how these extraordinary protests developed. So first of all, here we have some footage. This is obviously the immigration enforcement van, which is being stopped from driving off. It's already got detainees inside by neighbours of the people who have been detained. So you've got people there gathering around the van, other people sitting in the street, and that means the immigration enforcement van cannot move on. You can see there are already police arriving to try and manage the situation. Now, that was an incredibly successful move for those 10 or so people you could see in that video to make, because after that scene, what you had was call outs on social media. Hundreds and thousands even people sort of arrived to that street and ended up forming a cordon around the immigration removal van. It was not able to move. For the scale of the protest and the type of protest that took place, and we can show you the following clip. This is a clip of the police ostensibly trying to make their way through the crowd to escort a paramedic to the van. This is what happened. So at the end of that clip, you could see the policeman at the front telling the protesters about the paramedic and pointing and saying, that's why we want to come through. It's not, however, that clear that the police were needed to escort a paramedic through a non-violent protest. Now, according to some who were at the scene, the police may have been using the paramedic as an excuse to get amongst the protesters. Afterwards, the paramedic was let through without the police escort. What you could see there was the scale of the protest, lots of people sitting down to stop the police getting through, and you can see hundreds of people already outside that van. Now, not long after that clip we just showed you, lawyers addressed protesters and police, saying the only way the crowd would disperse is if immigration enforcement released the two men held in the van.
Open the doors!
And it was confirmed the protest had been successful when the police released the following statement. So this is from Mark Sutherland, who's Chief Superintendent of Police Scotland. He said, in order to protect the safety, public health and well-being of all people involved in the detention and subsequent protest in Kenmore Street, Pollokshields today, Police Scotland has, following a suitable risk assessment, taken the operational decision to release the men detained by UK immigration enforcement back into their community meantime. That decision was announced to the crowd by lawyers present before the men were released.
We have an agreement. It is in writing. These men will be released safely. They will not be arrested. There will be no enforcement action against them. And I have an agreement that the police will form a cordon around the van with myself and the two men. And then we will be walked to the mosque where they will be released.
An incredibly moving image of solidarity there. The men who were detained thanking the hundreds and thousands of protesters who had prevented their detention. Now, one of those detainees, Lakvir Singh, spoke to ITV after that protest and after they were released.
Do you have anything that you want to say to the people who came to support you today?
Yeah. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. That's all people. Thank you.
Speaking in his native Punjabi, Lakvir then told us what happened.
I was taken unannounced from my flat. They barged in and took me into the van. I was anxious and upset, wondering how I would be treated at the detention centre. I'm so happy that my fate brought me to live here in Glasgow, where the people are so connected that they'll come out onto the streets to help one of their own.
Appreciate it.
Another really, really moving clip. Now, it's all a clear example of direct action getting the goods and the power of solidarity. What's also interesting is that the mainstream politicians across most of Scotland's parties, other than the Conservatives, spoke out against the raids, very different to what you would likely see if that had happened in England. So Scottish Labour, the Greens and the SNP government all opposed the Home Office's actions on Thursday. After the police announced the release of the two detainees, Scotland's Justice Minister, Humza Yousaf, released this statement.
To take this action at any time is unwelcome in Scotland. To do so in the heart of the Muslim community on the day of Eid, where there have been outbreaks of COVID, is reckless, endangers health, and frankly looks like it was intended to provoke. I've spent hours trying to get the Home Office to abandon their operation. First, they passed me off to a civil servant when none of their 8 ministers would take my call. When we objected after that, they eventually gave us the most junior ranking Home Office minister to speak to the First Minister and I, and to say he was unhelpful, again, would be an understatement. Belligerently told us that they would continue to enforce immigration law as they saw fit. Now, I'm pleased and delighted, in fact, that Police Scotland, who of course have operational independence, Police Scotland have taken the decision in the interests of public safety, in the interests of public health, to release these two individuals. But immigration policy is, of course, reserved to the Home Office. And although these two individuals, and I'm pleased they have been released on this occasion, the hostile environment created by the UK government's immigration policies is something that is simply not welcome here in Scotland. And I will be urging the Home Secretary to speak to me and the Home Office to speak to me and to engage with the Scottish Government so that we simply do not see a repeat of these scenes, but more importantly, to tell them that their hostile environment is just not welcome in Scotland.
That was Humza Yousaf, the Justice Minister for Scotland. Now, you probably already have recognised that that's a very different way of speaking to the UK Home Office. Just to confirm that, a source at the Home Office told the BBC Newsnight's Lewis Goodall on Thursday night, it is completely unacceptable for a mob to stop the lawful removal of people living in our country illegally. We 100% back the front line in removing those with no right to be here. So a very I suppose, dismissive, fairly unpleasant in my reading statement from the UK Home Office. Now, to discuss the protests, I'm joined by Roza Salih. Roza was born in Iraqi Kurdistan and moved to Scotland as a refugee when she was 12. As a school child, she became known as one of the Glasgow girls when she and a group of friends successfully campaigned to prevent a classmate being deported. You were also at the protests yesterday. Roza, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Michael. Thank you very much for having me. Yes, I was at the protest and very overwhelmed by the people organizing and winning. I think was a huge victory for Glasgow, and throughout the world, I think everyone's looking towards Glasgow.
Yeah, and what was it like, the demonstration? I mean, it seemed to grow sort of exponentially, but it wasn't particularly organised, was my sense. Well, I mean, it couldn't have been organised because this was a spontaneous protest, really, wasn't it? Someone just noticed a van in the street, put it on social media, and then it spread by word of mouth, and ultimately you had hundreds, potentially thousands of people blocking an immigration van.
Yeah, I think initially the van was stopped by a man called Declan, which I've come aware of that he actually was under the van for over 8 hours. It wasn't organized in such ways because everything was by social media and people were sharing videos that this is a removal actually happening right this moment. However, people were contacting each other to come along and support and stop the enforcement by the Home Office. So that kind of organization actually happened after later on and community coming together. The neighborhood in that street in Pollock Shields, they all came together. And it's a very multicultural part of Glasgow, and different communities live there, and it was just wonderful how people, hundreds of people coming together, shoulder to shoulder, standing against the illegal enforcement, I would say, of asylum seekers, because it seems that they didn't have any legal advice, the two asylum seekers. And once we were there, there were a legal advice actually given to the asylum seekers, and we tried to communicate through one of the police officer there at the time to communicate and sign some forms so they can have legal representatives.
And you are, I mean, in an incredibly well placed to speak about the politics of migration in Scotland, because you arrived in Scotland as a child as a refugee. As I said in the introduction, you campaigned as a school child to prevent one of your friends being deported. You now work for an SNP MP. You've stood to be an MSP, so you really know both sides of this equation. You know the politics of the SNP, the governing party, and you know what it's like to be a refugee in Scotland. What can you tell me about the politics of migration in Scotland? And especially, I mean, from someone in London, from England, watching all of this, it seems like whilst the SNP don't have control of the migration system, the politics of migration in Scotland is much more humane than it is south of the border. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yes, I think that's the first statement that you've made. Our politics is much different, and the SNP, of course, the party that I represent and support, I would say we want to create a system that is based on fairness and dignity, where humans are treated with human rights, and there are no raids and there are no detention, and we have made statement that we will remove the Gable detention center once we become an independent country.
Would the SNP, I suppose, just to clarify for our audience, the SNP don't have control over migration policy. That's currently a competence held in Westminster, but obviously the SNP want it ultimately in an independent Scotland, but presumably also in a devolved UK if the UK were to stay together. What would the SNP's policy be? Because lots of the opposition to what happened yesterday, some of it was, I suppose, somewhat ambiguous. Were they opposing it because it was on Eid? Were they opposing it because it was a dawn raid? Or were they opposing it because they oppose detention and deportations in principle? The final one would be the more radical fundamental position. Is it your understanding that if the SNP had control over migration policy, they'd stop deportations in Scotland altogether?
Yes, I would say that there will be no deportation in Scotland, and there will be a humane system based on human rights and dignity. A system where actually the caseworker would speak to the asylum who's claiming asylum to stay in this country. So there will be more communication between the asylum seeker and their caseworker. So it's more humane, more direct, more communication. At this moment in the current system, there is no communication between the decision maker and the asylum person that's claiming asylum in this country. So there's a disconnect between the people really in that question. So it's very problematic the way the system is set up, and unfortunately, I do not believe there will be any reform because I have been experienced, I came to this country as an asylum seeker, and I'm grateful, because of my friends and my community campaigning for me to stay here. And it wasn't given to me that easily. And because of that, I think I see the failure of the system, how it's flawed, and we need to fix it. However, I do not believe in fixing it because of the Tory government of Priti Patel. They want to meet targets of deportation, and it's just numbers to them. There is no humanity in their system, and of course, it is a hostile environment they are creating for many asylum seekers. At this moment, the immigration rules are becoming more restrictive day by day. So if you go back 10 years ago, people could have applied for leave to remain in this country on indefinite leave if you stay in this country for 10 years. However, now they have extended to 20 years. So you can see that's just one example. There are many, many examples, even family reunion, people who've married abroad, spousal visa. If you're rich enough, you can marry someone from abroad. But if you're not rich enough, then unfortunately you cannot fall in love with someone abroad. This is the immigration system we have in place, and every aspect of it you look into, there's restrictions and barriers, and at the end of the day, is people's lives that are being affected.
Roza, Salih, thank you so much for speaking to us this evening, and also, well done for participating in such a successful protest. Our solidarity goes out to everyone who was involved in Glasgow on Thursday. Aaron, do you want to comment on that story? Because it is, in recent memory, I think one of the most effective and inspiring demonstrations I've probably ever in my lifetime I've seen. In this country, at least.
It's certainly up there, isn't it? Well, Scots would say it's a different country, Michael. It's certainly up there,
Fair
isn't
enough.
it? Stansted 15 was pretty impressive. The idea that this is only happening in Scotland, I don't think is accurate. This just happened to work. I'm aware of, and I'm sure there are many other ones, there's been anti-raids, activism, pushback, direct action, trying to obstruct the exact same thing in London many times I've seen, in Bristol, in many places in England. And that's not to say that it's, I would love it to be in hundreds of towns and cities. Of course it's not. But these kinds of actions have also been seen in England. They just haven't worked, or they've not had the critical mass. I think it's interesting that this had the entire street out. And I'm not going to say that would happen in England. You can imagine it happening in maybe Bristol, Brighton, parts of London, parts of Liverpool, parts of Manchester. And what I would say to people watching that say, oh, I want to move to Scotland. That's the wrong attitude for me. You know, you should say, how do we build that kind of thing right here in my community where I live? Because I think it's very easy to do. Not easy to do. It can happen. It's not impossible. And, you know, there's lots of stuff you can read about how to sort of push back on this, because immigration enforcement officers, they used to be called border force. They do technically have powers of arrest because they're constables, but fundamentally the way they work is they can treat non-UK nationals like absolute shit. But if a British citizen starts to push back on them and say, what are you doing? If they try to sort of passively obstruct the arrest, like as what happened in Glasgow yesterday, it makes it really difficult for them. So actually direct action against border force or immigration enforcement is really effective. It does work. The police weren't there to help them do that, by the way. The police were there to, quote unquote, stop a public order situation. The police don't exist generally to solve crime. They exist to keep the peace. In this instance, to deport, undocumented migrants. But you have to understand that if you have a sort of confrontation with immigration enforcement, like in Glasgow, it's not the same as you being at a protest and being in direct confrontation with the police. It's a very different sort of set of legal and political relationships, because they don't fundamentally, immigration enforcement don't have the political consent to go around arresting, attacking, assaulting UK nationals in order to get hold of and kidnap, effectively. That's what they do, non-UK nationals. So I think it's one of those areas, it may look like, oh, we can't do anything, oh wow, the overwhelming power of the state, but actually direct action in this context, as we saw in Glasgow, can be ultra effective. So if you want to do what happened in Glasgow in your own community, get involved with anti-raiser networks and so on. I mean, I know that you've in the past, Michael, have been very sort of critical and skeptical of the no borders activism, and maybe that's something you want to talk about very briefly, because I think it's important to say, it's perfectly possible for a liberal or somebody on the centre left to say we should shut down, Yarlswood and all these detention centres, we should quintuple the number of people in this country given asylum for a range of reasons, and we should clearly be far more positive and open in terms of economic migration, particularly from people from the global south. I think you can say all those things without saying no borders. Now, we've had problems with that on the left, because you say you have to sign up to this big project on no borders. I think it's possible in England as well as in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland to build a mass movement against any kind of immigration enforcement like what we saw in Glasgow yesterday. But it's not going to be ideologically homogenous. And I think if we're really interested in actually building class power against this stuff, we've got to accept that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd push back against the idea. I've never really had a problem with no borders activism. I have a problem with, or I'm not persuaded or convinced by the no borders, as I see it, a bit of a dogma, which is to say that, there's two positions, which is no borders or borders. And I mean, my reaction to no borders activism is a bit like my reaction to Extinction Rebellion. It's sort of, I don't necessarily sign up to all of the tenets, but ultimately, the practical things they're doing are pretty goddamn good. So I'll back those. While we're fighting for a more humane migration system, you might as well resist the inhumane one. Let's go straight on to our next but related story. A leading left-wing member of Labour's NEC has been suspended from the party after a tweet calling for Priti Patel to be deported in the wake of protests in Glasgow, which blocked a dawn raid detaining 2 asylum seekers. Howard Beckett, who is also in the running to be the next leader of Unite, tweeted the following: Priti Patel should be deported, not refugees. She can go along with anyone else who supports institutional racism. She is disgusting. Now, after posting that tweet, many people commented and responded that the tweet was potentially racist or had racist implications by calling for a politician from an immigrant background to be deported. In response, Howard Beckett deleted the tweet and apologized. However, Labour still announced he would be immediately suspended. That's pending an investigation. Howard Beckett spoke to Sky this morning and reiterated his apology for the tweet he sent.
I've already issued a personal apology to Priti Patel, Adam. As I said, that tweet was removed after 30 minutes. And I issued an apology saying that it was never intended to be interpreted literally. I'm against all forms of deportation. I, of course, know that you could never deport a Home Secretary, but I'm against all forms of deportation. And I apologise to anyone who read that that tweet literally, and I referenced Priti Patel specifically in that apology because that tweet was wrong. But I do not want that tweet to remove us from the debate about the treatment of refugees in our countries. It is vital that we talk about the most vulnerable in society and the racist behaviour of this Tory government.
I think that apology was... there was an element of disingenuous in it, because I don't think anyone thought he was literally saying Priti Patel should be deported. The reason the tweet was seen as problematic was because to call for any person of colour to be deported is very close to sort of the language of go home. It suggests they have somewhere to be deported to. Whether that was his intention, I think it probably wasn't, which I'll talk about in one moment. The other issue is, regardless of what you think of the tweet, was this done for factional purposes? Possibly. Lewis Goodall from Newsnight tweeted this last night. So he tweeted, Howard Beckett suspended from the Labour Party. Labour source, Keir is prizing McCluskey's cold, dead hand from the Labour Party. Aaron, I want your instant take on this. What do you make of the furore around Howard Beckett's tweet and his subsequent suspension?
One word, ridiculous. He said a stupid thing. He deleted it within 30 minutes. He apologised. Great. Let's move on. The fact that this somehow became an internal Labour faction story, when the real story, as we've already discussed, was working class people in Glasgow ensuring that two local citizens, some residents, weren't kidnapped by the British state. I mean, it's nauseating, and it's excruciatingly dull, and it doesn't serve any progressive interest whatsoever. We have all said stupid things, and particularly on Twitter, right? Myself included. And I think if you can't have a politics which accepts that people sometimes make mistakes, then you're not going to go anywhere. Of course, if there's a pattern, if Howard had said this 5, 6, 7, 8 times, yeah, of course, then you see a pattern of behaviour and you say, well, come on, this isn't good enough. But there isn't, as far as I can see. I'm happy to be corrected, but I've never seen anything like that before. So, figure of speech, he's apologised, move on. I had people on Twitter saying to me, no, it's outrageous, he should be kicked out of the Labour Party, white people. And I said, well, look, if you think he should be kicked out of the Labour Party, realistically, if you want to universalise that as a principle, you're not going to have any members left. And I said, well, you think he shouldn't be able to participate in public life? Oh, no, he just shouldn't be in the Labour Party. Well, what's the sort of intellectual basis by which you're saying he can't participate in the Labour Party, but he can be in Unite? Why? Because if you actually want to be serious and adult about this and say this is beyond the sort of the pale, this is impermissible for somebody participating in a political organisation, you have to have thought about it thoroughly. And clearly people like that hadn't.
I mean, I think there's two issues here, which is one, is it worthy of suspension? Absolutely not. And two, was it a problematic tweet? Because there's lots of people saying there's nothing wrong with that tweet at all. He's clearly saying it because she's the Home Secretary, not because she's of Indian background. Now, I think absolutely, I agree with you, Aaron. This does not warrant suspension. An apology should be more than enough. I do at the same time think whatever his intention, and I'm almost certain there was no racist intention behind this, even if it is fine to say, or even if in a way it seems similar to say, let's deport Theresa May, which people have said, by the way. I was also persuaded by people sort of showing examples of graffiti with let's deport Theresa May, people talking about this chant at demonstrations, obviously in the first half of the 2010s, where people said, let's deport Theresa May when she was Home Secretary. That it's not alien to say this. It's not clear that he only said this because she is of Asian background. At the same time, I think you do need to be more sensitive when someone is of Asian background, because racism does exist. And one instantiation of racism is people is an assumption that people have a different home to go to, which was, I think, clearly could be made there. So I think bad tweet, 100% bad tweet. Was it demonstrative of the racism of Howard Beckett? No. Is it right he deleted it? Yes. Should he be suspended? Absolutely no. Aaron, do you want a final word on this story?
Oh, I thought we'd go on for longer, but obviously it's a short one. No, I'd say, hate the sin, not the sinner. And like I say, I just found the whole thing. I found the whole thing just utterly absurd. And Michael, the thing is, look, I'm Iranian. If somebody says something like that to me and they apologise, I go, great, thank you. I move on. I don't hold on. If you believe me, and I'm white passing. If every brown black person held on to everything like that, everybody would be constantly like this. He said a stupid thing. He apologized. And what's really important, what's really, really important is, like I say, it's not a pattern. And what I would sort of criticize Howard for, because I've been saying this has been completely blown out of all proportion, is that he is seeking elected office at a very high level. He wants to lead one of the largest trade unions in the country. And I think somebody who's running for that kind of role shouldn't be saying that. And so I suppose we could have a debate where you say, look, if this was just a regular person on Twitter, this is absurd, it's ridiculous, it's obscene we're talking about this actually. It's obscene given the sort of the deportation policy and the rhetoric that Priti Patel is responsible for. But the fact he's seeking a very high office within Unite, okay, it makes it that bit more important. But even then, come on. I don't know if we're going to talk about the HRC, but the political response to it from the Labour Party, I mean, that just shows you that people like Keir Starmer, people around him, don't particularly care about the advice that was given to the Labour Party by the HRC last year. They're discarding altogether the idea that a disciplinary process should be impartial.
What's the evidence for that? Who made the decision? I'm not quite aware of the process. Is the idea that the decision was made by Keir Starmer and his team instead of the disciplinary bodies or whatever it is in HQ?
Well, I mean, so we need to see the timing, don't we? So he said what he said last night. We then found out through the media he was suspended. He didn't find out from the Governance and Legal Unit, GLUE. The media were told first, and then he found out. And then you get these briefings to various reporters. So the speed with which it was conducted, the fact it was given to journalists first, and thirdly, the fact you have a source go on record. And I trust Lewis Goodall. I don't think he would just say that if Peter Mandelson texted it to him. Maybe he would, but I think it's somebody who's got some proximity to the leadership. I think you put those three things together. It certainly doesn't look good in terms of an impartial disciplinary process. You know, and normally you get an email. That's what happens, right? You get an email. You've said X, Y, Z. How would you respond? That's what happens. You don't get a kind of public farrago, which is briefed first to journalists before the person who's suspended. So no, I think personally, you look at this, you look at Jeremy Corbyn, lots of similarities in how they were both suspended, and both fly in the face of what the HRC recommended. And by the way, Mike, it's important to say this, Peter Mandelson, on the day that the HRC report came out, the days that followed its publication, Peter Mandelson said, I don't like this. I don't want an impartial disciplinary process. I want a political disciplinary process so I can we, the Labour right, can get rid of people we don't like. So this shouldn't be a surprise that the Starmer leadership, factions in control of the Labour Party, that doesn't mean, by the way, that Keir Starmer's on the phone, get Howard Beckett out. It means people that he trusts in certain positions are driving that agenda, and he's not pushing back on it. Whether that's the gentleman that sits above the Governance and Legal Unit, his name is Alex Barras-Curtis. He is something of a bridge between the Leader's Office and the disciplinary mechanisms within the Labour Party. By the way, that means his job is entirely at odds with what the HRC recommended. His job effectively consists in politicising the disciplinary process. Doesn't make much sense, does it? I tweeted an article, I wrote about that last year earlier on today. In any case, you look at Corbyn, you look at this, come on, this isn't what the HRC was recommending. And I think it shows actually the hypocrisy at the heart of the whole debate over the last several years, which is a shame because we all said, you know, on the day of the publication of the report, not everybody, but in Novara Media, I think we generally agreed these recommendations are actually pretty useful, pretty good. You know, yeah, you should have a disciplinary process which is fair and equally applied to everyone, regardless of who they are. That's not what we've got, in my opinion.
I mean, I don't think many people would say that's what we've got. Let's go to our final story of the night and of the week. Right. The world has changed since the 1990s, but Britain's zombie Blairites still have their head in the sand. So what happens when a Blairite is confronted by the fact that the positions they used to consider hard left are in fact now very much in the mainstream? We discovered the answer this week on Politics Live when Blairite comedian Matt Ford clashed with Labour peer Shami Chakrabarti.
Can we support President Biden and the Pope now and all these Nobel laureates in saying, let's have the TRIPS waiver that is recommended by the WHO and not just side with Big Pharma, but actually share knowledge and technology and recipes and capacity to vaccinate the world?
Matt, you're looking sceptical.
Well, I just think this Big Pharma thing
Big pharmaceutical companies, yeah.
It's just kind of an immature thing to be saying. Like, without pharmaceutical companies, we wouldn't have these vaccines. And I think AstraZeneca and others deserve huge credit for putting their brightest minds at the service of the planet. And this kind of weird hard left view that all private enterprise is negative or sinister is odd, and it certainly doesn't chime with the public, who are grateful that AstraZeneca have done. Without AstraZeneca, I wouldn't have had 2 jabs. I wouldn't have the protection I've got. Well, thank God for pharmaceutical companies.
Well, Shami, your weird hard left view, is it true that you wouldn't have had the development
my
of these
weird hard
vaccines?
left view is apparently being supported by President Biden, the Pope, Gordon Brown, Mary Robertson,
Jesus, the Easter Bunny.
I'm not here to mudsling.
Hang on,
I'm
Matt.
sorry,
Hang
I'm
on,
not
hang on,
here
Matt.
to
But
mudsling.
Shami, there is an important, serious point about the fact that would these pharmaceutical companies have developed these vaccines if the patents were in the way that you have described, sort of open and free to everyone?
Well, I'm supporting a temporary waiver in pandemic circumstances. And I would also say that, yes, of course, science is a collaborative thing, but governments and charitable institutions have invested a huge amount in these vaccines, including the Oxford vaccine. I think it's like over 90% of the investment in the development of the Oxford vaccine came from government and charitable purposes. I'm not here to mudsling, Joe. These issues are just far too serious.
All right, well, we're going to move on because we're going to talk...
So Matt Ford there, who's like a big fan of Tony Blair. He's one of these centrist comedians who aren't actually funny. I've never seen them tell a joke, but they seem to get invited on shows on the basis that they're not just any other political commentator, they're a comedian. I think he does impressions, actually. He was there suggesting, when Shami Chakrabarti was saying, look, this isn't a hard left position because it's held by Gordon Brown, it's held by the Pope, it's held by Joe Biden. He then says, and what about Jesus and the Easter Bunny? Now, I mean, what planet is he on? Because the Pope and Gordon Brown and Joe Biden, they're all real people, right? You can't say she's just magically picking up made up people out of the air. We're going to talk about the defense of AstraZeneca he made there and some of the sort of more nitty gritty of who invested in what. Was it public? Was it private finance? First, though, Aaron, I want to hear from you because for me, whilst that was a ridiculous, not particularly informative clip, I haven't seen any better representative better representation of zombie Blairism than seeing someone dismiss a position as hard left and then finding themselves to the right of the Pope and the US president. What did you make of it?
I mean, I thought it was quite illustrative, actually, because people like to sort of present, the Corbynites as unhinged, uninformed, ignorant. They pursue protest over power. And actually, that was the complete inverse, that interaction, because Matt Ford had no idea what he was talking about. Shami Chakrabarti, a highly decorated woman in her field, was at Liberty, a human rights lawyer, massively intelligent, hugely articulate, and she was giving an evidenced, thorough, sequentially, premised argument. And Matt Ford's going, the Easter Bunny. And you just think, you've been calling the people on the left in this country kind of ignorant and not with it, and yet you're mocking, like you say, Joe Biden and the Pope, but then Gordon Brown. I mean, Gordon Brown was Tony Blair's number 2 for a decade. So I think, to me, it really illustrates, like you say, Michael, zombie Blairism, because they just have so little to offer. And you could do that when you were mocking the left in a position of power. When Jeremy Corbyn was Labour Party leader, you could do that. You could just throw stuff and stuff would stick. But now that people like Matt Ford having to be potentially listened to, the Labour right being potentially listened to as a political constituency that want to govern the country, they'd quite like to run things, but they have nothing to offer. And so for me, it was very emblematic of, like I said, the zombie Blairism and the complete inability. Let's be quite honest. Of people, the agrocentrists, as you and I are very familiar with them on Twitter, the agrocentrists are out of ideas, out of how to be popular, out of how to politically engage with people, and they have absolutely no understanding of the political moment that we inhabit in 2021, with the climate crisis, with the aftermath of the global financial crisis, with COVID-19, with the rise of China, all these incredible generationally defining phenomena. And they're just smirking and mocking people and looking stupid and thick, quite frankly. Although I have to correct you on one thing, Michael. I did a podcast with Matt Ford. I have to say, on a personal level, he was perfectly affable. Politically, I think he's not quite there. But he does a pretty good impression of Donald Trump. Don't hate
Interesting.
me.
So he's affable.
Don't hate me.
Even no, maybe he's much nicer behind the camera than in front of it. That's potentially true. That's the case for lots of people. Let's get into the policy side of this now, because Shami Chakrabarti referenced there the funding of the Oxford vaccine. We can look at some details of what she was talking about. So this was reported in The Guardian a while ago. Research which was conducted by the advocacy group Universities Allied for Essential Medicines UK. So they looked into the funding of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and conducted two lines of inquiry. So on the one hand, they looked at the source of funding for the final vaccine product. So who funded that final stage development of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine? They also looked at hundreds of millions of pounds in research grants from the year 2000 onwards, and that was for published work into the technologies that went on to be used in the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. So they're trying to have a holistic image, or holistic picture, of all the investments going into that vaccine that led to that vaccine. And what they found was that the overwhelming majority of the money, especially in the early stages of the research, came from UK government departments, British and American scientific institutes, the European Commission, and charities, including the Wellcome Trust. Less than 2% of the identified funding came from private industry, the researchers said, a finding they said posed a challenge to the views of people such as Boris Johnson, who has said the record-fast development of COVID-19 vaccines was because of capitalism and was because of greed. Now, this was all reported in The Guardian. The authors of the original report did say, we can't say you should treat this 2% figure as gospel. It turns out that the funding of scientific endeavours is often quite opaque, and also it's quite difficult to properly ascertain what research any final product drew from. But what they were clear about, and what The Guardian was clear about, is that whether it's 2%, whether it's 10%, whether it's 30%, it's very clear that private industry is putting in a minority of funding when it comes to these vaccines, and taking a minority of risk, basically a small amount of risk. Most of the risk is being taken by the public. We can see this this is a chart used by The Guardian laying out the various sources of funding that led to the Oxford AstraZeneca jab. And you can see here, this was based on Freedom of Information requests. And you can see that funding for that jab, £38.8 million came from the UK government, £26.2 million came from overseas governments, £22.6 million came from charity, £13.2 million came from public-private partnerships, and only £1.9 million from industry. From other sources, there was £1.1 million. Now, obviously, public-private partnerships, some of that money is going to be private, but you can see the big three categories there. The vast majority of the money that went towards that vaccine was from UK governments and overseas governments, and from charities. So the idea that you needed future profit margins to incentivize the development of that vaccine is for the birds, really. I mean, the risk was taken by the public sector, so why should the intellectual property not be owned by the public sector? Aaron, what do you make of this particular argument? I mean, Joe Biden has now come around to this position. I don't think the UK government has. I know that Angela Merkel was one of the people blocking the idea that we should have patent-free vaccines when it comes to COVID-19. The argument against patents is pretty strong, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, right now I think it looks like it's just although no longer the US, but at one point it was just the US, Brazil, and basically the EU. And the rest of the world was opposed to this. Important to say as well, Michael, it's not just the AstraZeneca vaccine or vaccines like it, which have been subject to massive public funding. mRNA as a technology was entirely untried and untested before the pandemic. Very unique way of administering a vaccine, mRNA. And it had the funding it did fundamentally because of federal government in the years leading up to this, because there's very low, very high risk, very low return on that kind of research, genuine innovation. And so generally speaking, only the government wants to or will fund it. And so we wouldn't have mRNA technology, i.e. we wouldn't have, the BioNTech, the Moderna vaccines without funding from the US federal government over the last 5 years. There's an abundance of pieces on that. Please just Google it. Government funding mRNA vaccine. You've got government funding, of course, for the procurement and the scaling up of production the last year. Again, the private sector's not doing that. Are we going to talk about the free market? The free market's so rational. Is it going to administer the vaccine? We don't need the government at all. Nobody says that because everybody knows it's wrong-headed and stupid. And the same thing goes to the research phase. And you're absolutely right, Michael. It gets to the heart of who benefits from public investment in these kinds of things. We have the same debate in regards to satellite technology, SpaceX. It's the exact same debate. We've had socialized investment, so why are the gains being privatized? Elon Musk now one of the wealthiest people in the world, primarily it should be said from Tesla. But why is he gaining so much from decades of historic investment by the US taxpayer? I think most people would say that's unfair. You look at the first rocket that ever passed something called the Kármán line, which effectively means it went into space. It was a V2 rocket in 1944. You then get the Russians get on that vibe. They launched Sputnik, I think, in 57. And of course, you have the Apollo missions in the late 60s. Should be said, by the way, the Saturn V, still to this day, the most powerful machine ever created by human beings. That was modelled fundamentally on the V2s built by the Germans. Werner von Braun, who worked on the V2 program, was one of the masterminds of the NASA space program. But fundamentally, that was all done because of the state. Now, a private company doesn't do that. A private company doesn't send a first stage booster, I think you would say, into space. Well, with the second stage, 2 stages. Let's not get too complex here. They basically don't put a rocket into space until I think it's 2008 with SpaceX. So you're looking here at a kind of the delay is more than 60 years. 60 years was the difference between the state doing it, 50 years if you want to talk about the Russians and the Americans, and a private business doing it. And that obviously completely denudes this myth that, all innovation comes from the private sector. The state is useless. Public investment always wastes money. No, actually it turns out in real innovation, it's almost always the state. And the point is private enterprise crowds in as soon as it becomes profitable. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. And this isn't, by the way, a particularly marginal left-wing argument anymore. Somebody like Mariana Mazzucato would talk about it, very overtly. People like her are now being listened to in policy circles by people like, Joe Biden's team. Today, Keir Starmer said in The Guardian, or Rachel Reeves actually, Keir Starmer tweeted it, we want to be like Joe Biden in the US. Also, Rachel Reeves is going to talk to, guess who? Mariana Mazzucato. So the idea that, the Easter Bunny or Jesus or Elvis, no, actually, it's really smart people, Matt Ford, who teach at the highest levels of economic policy, like Mariana Mazzucato, who talk about this. And by the way, Rachel Reeves is now listening to her. Maybe Matt Ford should be a little bit more informed about things if he's going to go on TV and talk about them.
Very good conclusion to that section and to the show. Aaron, it has been a pleasure speaking to you this Friday, as always.
It's been my pleasure, Michael.
And it's been a pleasure being joined by all our viewers this Friday evening. Thank you so much for your comments, your super chats, your tweets. And thank you so much for anyone who is a Novara Media supporter. You make all of this possible. If you are not already a regular donor, please do sign up at novaramedia.com/support. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.